Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our panel, Hearing the Arctic's Call, It's Time to Act as One. I'm Annegret Hannawa. I'm a professor of communication science at the Università della Svizzera, Italiana in southern Switzerland, and I'm welcoming you to this discussion today. If there's one core characteristic that defines us as humans, it's our communication. Ever since humanity has taken its first breath, we have used our communication with each other to keep us safe. We used to gather around the fire and tell each other stories about our day, about threats and dangers to watch out for. Still today, we sit at the table with our parents who tell us stories, myths, sagas, and fairy tales from ancient times and from older times, telling us things that we should watch out for, telling how to live in ways where we can stay safe and have a promiseful future. So I'm excited today to be here at this panel together, also here, people to a table from different sciences, from different backgrounds, to calibrate stories from their fields into a coherent togetherness as we're facing Arctic issues and how to turn them to resolves. In particular, we're going to focus on three things. How can we use information we have attained from various different sciences, and actually turn them into communication to make sure that that information is not just received, but also understood? How can we ensure that people who receive that information not only understand it, but also believe it? And then last but not least, how can we make sure those people that receive and believe the information also know how to act upon it with motivation? So in summarizing, we would like to focus on the communicative efforts that will lead to a yes to all these three questions. And that stated, I would like to introduce our panelists briefly for today. Taking the seat on the far right is Bryndís Haraldsdóttir. She's a former OSCE representative for Arctic issues, and she is here representing the Icelandic Parliament and therefore the perspective of politics today. Next to her sits Michael Wilson from the University of Loughborough in the United Kingdom. He's a professor of storytelling, and he also leads a storytelling academy at his university. Next to that, in red, we see Gabriela Sigurðardóttir. She's from the University of Iceland. She's a professor of psychology and talking today about behavioral change. Then we have Amanda Wilson from the University of West England. She leads a program in science communication at her university. Then we go further down to Nathalie Sanchez-Carubin. She's from the University of Amsterdam, and today talking about digital cultures, digital tools that we can use for our storytelling efforts or for our communications about Arctic issues. And then last but not least, we have Matthias Albert, professor of political science from the University of Bielefeld in Germany. So I'm welcoming all of you to our storytelling table here today. And of course also the audience and participating later on in our discussion. So, to kick off our panel, Bryndís, I would like to start off asking you from a political perspective and also from your former role as OSCE representative on Arctic issues, how are we doing and how we communicate about Arctic issues? Are we triggering communicative wildfires that are promoting change, that are giving people hope in how to act and make a better future for ourselves? Or do you feel like we're somewhere stuck?
Thank you very much. And first and foremost, thank you very much for inviting me to this great panel. I have to be very political in that sense and saying, well, yes and no, in a sense. So, telling a small, short story, I was elected to the parliament in 2016, and I was in the environmental committee, the foreign committee, and then the West Nordic Council. West Nordic Council is parliamentarians from Iceland, Faroe Island, and Greenland participating together. So, in a way, it all came to the Arctic, in a sense, because everything about Arctic is, of course, an environmental issue, and it is like a huge foreign policy, very important foreign policy for Iceland. At that time, the West Nordic Council had been applying for being an observer to the Arctic Council. And that came through. So I started to learn a lot about the indigenous people, went to Greenland, Faroe Islands, and studied a lot about Arctic issues, everything about that. And I was so amazed. It was so interesting. But then it was, there was a dissolution of the government only a year after that. So in 2017, we again went to election. And I was at a political meeting in my constituents, and they were asking me, okay, Bryndís, what have you been doing for this year in the parliament? And I was, well, I've been doing a lot about Arctic issues and started to discuss what the issues were. This is an environmental issue. It's also very important in foreign policy. And the people there were just like, not interested at all. And I actually got the question, really? What does that do for us? Maybe I didn't answer the question well enough, or maybe I did, but I was re-elected. And I saw a year later that the same crowd had organized a meeting, and the main speaker was Mr. Ólafur Ragnar Grímsson, talking about the Arctic. So at least a year later, even though they didn't think it was interesting, a year later they thought it was really interesting. So after that, I left the West Nordic Council, but I started in the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, where we have like hard politics, all the discussion about what has been happening in Iran, in Afghanistan, Palestine, Israel, all of that. And I was thinking, okay, but how can we also get the focus up north to what is happening in the Arctic? So I was appointed as special representative for Arctic issues, and I was trying to put forward this information in more visual reports, showing like the ice is melting, what is happening, and putting forward some statements. And I think, yeah, I got a little bit of interest, a little bit more than the year before. But then when I was driving home from the parliament, sometime this week, we had like the science board gave out this report here in Iceland on the effects of climate changes. And I'm guessing that there had been saying news about that, and then they had this like opened up for telephone, so people could call in and say their meaning about things. And oh my God, they were calling in, and someone said, how does that affect me? Come on, we live in Iceland. Isn't it just good that we have some more warm and things like that? Aren't there opportunities also in that? What can Iceland really do, even though I changes my lifestyle and stop driving my diesel truck? That will not change anything. So I was again, oh my God, we are not there. So this was a little bit of yes and no. We are doing good in some senses, but we definitely have to do better.
Wonderful, thank you, Brenda. So there's space for improvement. Maybe also now introducing Mike as the next person, I will ask a question to some creativity, some creative efforts. So I don't know about everyone here, but when we hear about talk about climate change, oftentimes we feel a bit threatened, sometimes anxious, even attacked with finger pointed at us, and we may want to run into the opposite direction. Mike, how can storytelling help us voice Arctic issues to the public in a different way, maybe even with an impact like Little Red Riding Hood and the Wolf, which is a fairy tale that is known all over the globe. It has spread at times where there was no iPhones, no television, and no technology, but everybody knows the story and the messages for safety that it sends to us. How does storytelling inform better or more successful communication about Arctic issues?
Thank you, Annegret. So I think there's a danger in asking somebody who runs a storytelling research centre to speak on storytelling, because we could be here this time tomorrow if I'm not careful. So I'm going to limit myself to 3 points that I'd like to make about why I think storytelling can be of value to us in this context, and then also squeeze in a short story, very short story that I want to tell you as well. So point number 1 is, to my mind, that storytelling is a democratic practice. It's a democratic practice, and what I mean by that is, firstly, that to tell a story is to demand to be heard. And secondly, that we all tell stories. Storytelling is a practice. It is not owned by any particular culture or any particular group of people. It is something that we all do. We are indeed homo narens. We are storytelling creatures. And therefore, storytelling has the capacity, I think, to democratize the space in which these kinds of necessary conversations can take place, and has the ability to bring in voices that are perhaps previously unheard or indeed underheard. I've heard a fair bit this week about the danger of exclusionary languages, whether that is the limitations of English as a lingua franca, or whether it's the specialist languages of academia or scientific language or legal or technocratic or bureaucratic. These can be exclusionary languages if you're not part of that community. And storytelling has the capacity to be a great leveller in that sense. Point 2 is that storytelling is not just about communication. Of course it is. I mean, storytelling is a very helpful vehicle for communicating both simple and complex ideas. But it's about dialogue. It's not a one-way communication. Because if to tell a story is to demand to be heard, to tell a story is also to invite a response. The telling of a story immediately asks the listener to respond with another story, and that's how these stories get passed on and get passed around. So we're talking about a co-created communication. And therefore, storytelling is also a tool for thinking and understanding. One of the things we do very well as human beings is we think with stories and think through stories. And point 3 is storytelling is not a magic bullet. I'm not going to stand here and pretend that storytelling is going to solve the climate crisis or any other challenge or crisis we may be facing at this time. But as a knowledge system, storytelling can work exceedingly well with other knowledge systems, in partnership with other kinds of knowledge, because it allows us to see things differently and to imagine different possibilities. Now, there's nothing new in anything that I've said there, I don't think. Storytelling is a powerful tool that we've evolved as human beings over millennia. So why would we not want to deploy it? Because in the rush to embrace other forms of knowledge, we've forgotten sometimes about the power of storytelling, and yet there it is all the time, hiding in plain sight. So those are my 3 points, and I want by illustration to tell you a story. And actually, I'm going to start to move around because it seems odd to tell a story from behind a desk to me. So I'm just going to come out here. And I hope everyone can hear me because this is a story, it's a traditional story. And I want to tell you this story because it's very, very widespread. The version I'm going to tell you is one that I heard in the UK, but I imagine that a lot of people today in this room will say, oh yeah, I've heard a similar story. I know a version of that story from where I'm from. But this is the story. It's only very short. It's about a very handsome man. I have long flowing locks, nice chiseled jaw, very, very attractive all round. Little smirks there. Anyway, and he was very well dressed. He had a beautiful coat, and that coat was coloured with the threads of all the colours of the rainbow, and many others besides, and lots of pictures all of that. In fact, so beautiful was his coat, it enhanced his own beauty. And that man would walk the highways and byways of the land. He'd visit the towns and the villages, different houses, and wherever he went, he was always made welcome. The doors would open. When news travelled that he was visiting a house, people would come from the neighbouring houses to see him. And there was always food and drink, and there was laughter and music, and the best seat was always reserved for the traveller. And that, of course, was a large chair right in front of the fire. But there was also a woman. And as elegant and flamboyant as the young man was, the woman was rather plain and drab. In fact, some people were unkind enough to call her ugly. And she travelled the same highways and byways as the man. She visited the same towns and villages, visited the same houses, but she was never made welcome. People would not open their doors to her. They shut their doors, closed their curtains, and sometimes hide behind the furniture and pretend they weren't at home. And she was turned away without food or drink or anywhere to spend the night, out into the wind and rain. And one day, the man and the woman met at a crossroads, because that's in stories where people meet. And they met at the crossroads, and she said to him, she said, look here a minute, what's going on here? I travel the same highways and byways as you, I visit the same towns and villages, I visit the same houses, but you are always welcomed and given food and drink, and I'm always turned away, cold and wet and hungry and tired. Why is that? And the young man scratched his head and he said, well, truly, I don't know. Who are you? And the woman said, well, my name is Truth. And it seems that people will not welcome truth into their homes, especially if it's plain and ugly. But who are you? And he said, well, my name is Story. And people will always open their doors and their hearts and their ears to story. But don't worry, he said. Look, there's far more hospitality than I can cope with. There's far too much to go round. So why don't you travel with me? Come in, climb under my coat, and we'll travel together and enjoy that hospitality, both of us. And she thought that was a grand idea. So she climbed under his coat, and off they went. And from that day, they travelled together. Sometimes she'd be hidden in the folds of his coat. Sometimes they'd walk hand in hand. Sometimes she'd ride on top of his shoulders for everyone to see. But that's why these days, wherever you find Story, truth will always be lurking somewhere near at hand. And that's the story.
Thank you, Mike. What a beautiful illustration. Thank you so much, Mike. Yes, so storytelling allows us to package information and bring it to the people in a way where they want to listen. So information is one part of that, but then there's still a big step from listening and hearing and understanding information to actually changing one's behavior. Gabriela, what does it take to change people's behavior? What determines and drives behavior and behavior change, particularly in the context of uncomfortable sacrifice and losses, such as they are implied by Arctic issues?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a big question, Annegret. But we are aware that when it comes to issues of climate change and environmental protection, it is very important that we change our behavior, and especially the behavior that has gotten us into trouble in the first place. A lot has been done to try to affect the behavior of people through the power of words. And by this I mean with education, campaigns and lectures, discussions, reminders, increasing opportunities to engage in pro-environmental behaviors. And this is all good and fine, but there are more effective ways to change behavior. Behavior is lawful and is mostly affected by the consequences that follow it. Behavior has to have payoffs in order to increase, and the quicker those payoffs follow and the more reliable that they are following the behavior, the more likely it is that the behavior is going to increase. Sometimes the payoff may be avoiding a problem. Pro-environmental behavior often conflicts with payoffs for all sorts of habits that we have developed that damage the environment. If we want to change those damaging habits that have had payoffs and get people to sacrifice those payoffs, for example, by eating less meat or traveling less to distant destinations for vacations, or spending time, effort, and money in the pro-environmental behaviors, then the new behaviors have to have payoffs too. Otherwise, they will not increase. It seems to me that this fact has not been a big part of what has been done until now, with a few exceptions. For example, when I take my bottles and cans to the recycling center, I get money. And the more I bring, the more money I get. And recently in Iceland, I was able to spare some fees if I purchased an electric car instead of a gas or an oil-driven vehicle. Doing so also had some other payoffs, like getting social recognition for doing the right thing, or getting praised for my cool car by my neighbors. or maybe even engaging in conversations with others who also have an electric car. So payoffs for behavior do not necessarily need to be big monetary gains. Social rewards and recognition are often more esteemed, like the example I gave with the car. Temporary power, like being allowed to take a decision or make a choice. Tangible items like a keychain, a pen, or a discount card. The opportunity to engage in a preferred activity, like going to the theater or a football game, or access privileges like a parking space, or to get the first hour free of charge when I park downtown for 1 month, or 1 week, or 3 months, can also be used as payoffs to get behavior change. Perhaps communities could organize the selection of representatives that could provide rewards to residents of a street or neighborhood when the number of residents who have, for example, electric cars increases there, or when all residents are recycling, and the reward can be just getting people to come together in a barbecue the following spring. So in short, payoffs are very important if we are going to affect behavior of individuals and groups, especially when the higher effort and costs and even discomfort are associated with the behavior change. The new behavior has to have payoffs, and the power of words is not enough to affect the behavior change.
Thank you, Gabriela. Wonderful. So we've learned that storytelling reaches people. Psychology adds insights as to how such stories can be framed and worded to actually change behavior. But at the heart of both lies information that needs to be conveyed. Amanda, you're an expert in science communication. How can we convey such information to lay audiences or even to policymakers in effective ways?
Okay, thank you for inviting me. So science communication is essentially about having conversations and telling stories about science, usually between a scientist and a non-specialized audience. But it's a very broad discipline. It's grounded in society, so it's always changing and developing and evolving. But if we're thinking about communicating around the Arctic and climate change, and I'm particularly thinking about audiences that do not live here, this requires many different approaches. And I would argue that key is understanding our audiences and building trust with them. Now, there is a lot of research around this, but as the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us, we don't know enough, particularly about hard-to-reach, uninterested, and sometimes hostile audiences. And they're exactly who we need to engage with and understand better. So in science communication, we do have some models that help us think about how we actually convey information. So there's the deficit model, which is essentially one-way sort of movement of information from experts to non-specialists, with a view of increasing knowledge and plugging a deficit. Now, this has been really critiqued. Many will argue it is defunct. It doesn't recognize other forms of knowledge apart from scientific knowledge. It considers audiences as empty vessels, whereas we know we all come with different experiences, cultural backgrounds, values, worldviews, and that affects how we interpret information. So the deficit model is really problematic, as it assumes knowledge literacy will then lead to understanding and caring about science. But it still persists, probably because it's quicker and easier to do. Now, what I'm not saying is that we should never have information or sharing information or one-way approaches, because sometimes we need it, and sometimes our audiences will demand it of us. And again, it's about knowing your audience. So, for example, the European Commission's Science for Environmental Policy translates complex scientific information for policymakers, and it's very effective. But what I believe we need is a movement towards models of dialogue and participation, so creating conversations, moving to co-production of knowledge with scientists and non-specialists on an equal footing. And we need to start by understanding what our audiences want to know. So an example here is the climate change toolkit that was co-developed with young people to empower them to lead in their own communities. Now, we have been talking, but this is not new. We've been talking about this for a long time. There was a great session yesterday with examples from the Sami Council on co-production, and I really hope some of you managed to catch that. But in terms of working with audiences that are at a distance from the Arctic, we need to do more. How do we do that? Well, it's difficult. We need to know our audiences and we need to engage with them in a more meaningful way. So as I said, it's about building long-term relationships and trust. And this is as key for policymakers as it is for lay audiences. So for example, if you're a scientist and you're wanting to work with policymakers, you need to understand the constraints that these groups are under. You need to understand the dynamic environment, the policy cycle, when's good timing for engaging with that audience. If you're working with non-interested groups and audiences, you need to understand what they are interested about. What are their challenges? And it has to be from their standpoint. This may mean, and this can be uncomfortable, focusing on issues other than climate change to make an impact. We need to listen and find out what's relevant and important to our audience. And it can't just be about pushing information out in the hope that increased awareness will lead to change. Now, to end on a good note, there are lots of opportunities now for non-scientists to engage with science, which is brilliant. But despite a lot of research in this area, we are yet to make and create meaningful dialogue with many audiences, particularly those that are harder to reach. And this will take time, it will take long-term funding, and a willingness to engage with groups that may see the world differently from ourselves.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So there are multiple audiences. It's about reaching those audiences, and not only in our physical world, but also online. There are different cultures and subpopulation groups with different beliefs and values that we have to understand to reach them. Natalia, in your work, you deal with cultures that live in this online world. You call them digital cultures. What establishes and drives these cultures? How do they work?
So maybe to answer the question, I can reframe it also in Mike's language. And that would be that story and truth never travel alone, at least online. So stories and messages about climate and science, they don't exist in a vacuum. Instead, they're just one of the many ingredients that make up a person's media diet. And effective communication needs to take into account and understand this idea of a media diet. So imagine you create a message about an issue of the cause you're working on and you want to post it online. Your message is going to appear in a person's content feed surrounded by other content. Imagine now you're scrolling through your social media feed. You're going to see a 30-second video about a sustainable fashion brand that you follow. It's an update from your friend of what they were doing last night. Maybe a photo by some travel influencer that you follow and they're going around in their private jet. You keep scrolling, cute animals, but also reports about war. So the stories you want to tell, the messages you want to communicate, are going to exist alongside also the irony and the irreverence of online culture. It's going to appear next to memes. The NGO is going to be speaking next to the climate influencer, and then we know who is more popular online. And your message is going to be framed by all those other pieces of content made by professionals, non-professionals, sustainability lifestyle content creators, and also people working on different issues that are not climate related, but are going to frame how that message reaches someone, be that feminism, other political kind of topics, and also there is disinformation. And here, perhaps the most kind of relevant point is that we don't control our media diets. Many decisions are being made for us. What we see in our content feeds depends on our previous behavior, what we clicked, what we follow, but also what is trending right now, what the algorithm considers is relevant for you, also about what's in the news and what your friends are watching. So the conversation is not really between the scientist or the communicator and their audience in a direct line. Everything and everyone else is there and involved. So I think as communicators, it's important to think also in, but also beyond the idea of profiling audiences as demographics based on our own research. It's not only about who we think they are, but we also need to take into account who the social media algorithm thinks they are. Because those two realities are coming together, and that's where our messages are. So I think that's also one of the points in which kind of digital researchers, digital ethnographers, people from media studies can become good partners in science communication. Because indeed, online media and apps are a space where ideas are being formed, people are receiving education, where is the place where we'll go to unwind and talk about current events. And people do have diverse media diets, and your message is just one of many little ingredients. So we need to ask ourselves, how is this other content shaping people's views and creating perhaps bubbles of thought? And how does these dynamics, how do they affect how your message is received? And you need to think about also who is your message and competing with as part of like these very diverse media diets that we don't really control or decide completely what they look like.
Thank you, Natalia. Okay, so we need to understand what connects the people in our audience and in very proficient ways, as you just mentioned, and also there are multiple audiences, and they're sometimes intertwined. So as scientists engaging in science communication effectively, we need to identify these audiences. Who do we want to reach? Who do we need to reach? Each of them is a unique puzzle piece coming into and impacting the whole. Gabriela, very briefly, can we categorize audiences scientifically to ensure that we reach most of them or all of them in most effective ways?
Yes, I think we can. We can categorize audiences with scientific methods. Some efforts have been done already in a laboratory setup on the internet with a procedure called the Work for Environmental Protection task. In this task, participants have to work on a number identification boring task. And when finishing one page, the researcher donates money to an environmental organization for the protection of tropical forests. The more pages the participants are willing to work on, the more money they produce for the organization. Some participants have to work longer and more than others, and some of them produce larger benefits than others. After each page they complete, they can choose to continue or to quit. And by continuing, they produce more benefits for the organization. Results have shown that in order to increase work on this task, the higher the benefits have to be. Also, the endurance of the individual at this task matches statements they give on the commitment to protect the environment and with the number of concerns they express about the environment. The opposite is also true. The higher the egoistic values reported by the participants, the less pages the participant completes. So this study is an example of how we can categorize audiences depending on how strong their pro-environmental behavioral tendencies are and reach out to them on that basis.
Wonderful, thank you, Gabriela. So we can actually customize messages once we understand what kind of behavioral payoffs people respond to. Natalia, we already have digital pathways also, right, to reach consumers in personalized ways, and artificial intelligence is sort of taking over the field now in that realm. Can such digital tools or innovations help us with this need for targeted messaging so that we reach our target groups with customized messages that serve their understanding?
So I mean, definitely science communicators should take advantage of all the tools at their disposal, right? Be that computational techniques, AI, digital marketing, however, while also developing an ethical framework for doing so. You might remember some years ago the Cambridge Analytica scandal, in which basically, I mean, the scandal was around like the backlash against a specific data firm that improperly obtained personal data from Facebook users by misleading them into answering these quizzes about the personality. However, the data was then sold to people building very detailed voter profiles to micro-target pro-Trump messages to social media users with the idea of changing their alliance. And the promise was to build behavioral models that were powerful enough to manipulate people's activity online and behavior and potentially sway the elections. And that went down as a success story or a scandal depending on who you ask. However, the techniques that were used, all the promises, that were made and maybe fulfilled or maybe not, those are critiques of how far this can go, did not only violate regulations about data use and protection and transparency, but also created filter bubbles around political ideas. And then we saw terms like systemic manipulation, propaganda, the distortion of messages, a betrayal of trust being used and associated with practices such as micro-targeting when it comes down to collective issues. And we don't want these words to be associated with projects about the environment. So computational tools do offer exciting ways for knowing our audiences and automating perhaps aspects of the research and the communication and tweaking and refining. But we need to do this with a critical mindset. I think we need to kind of ask ourselves, do the tools and methods that we use, do they align with the values we want to advocate for? How do we minimize harm when using these computational tools and big data? So yes, how do we take advantage of personalization also without diluting messages and collective causes to the extreme that there's no common goal? If the methods that you're using in your project, if they become public, can you stand by them? Especially if they become involved in a bigger conversation about AI ethics or digital rights or privacy, can you stand by the methods you're using? And could perhaps lack of transparency, sort of kind of aspects of the methods can also alienate a public because they might feel manipulated, or they might be also engaged in different issues like privacy and autonomy and transparency, and suddenly your message, well-intended, clashes with other types of worldviews. So could the method also isolate these publics that you might be trying to reach? In other words, to which extent does the means justify the ends, and how to, as a scientist and as a communicator, take a position with that and take kind of measures of, reduce harm, carefulness. So basically, the question for science communication is how to reduce harm, how to use these tools responsibly, and also where to draw the line.
Thank you, Natalia. And we spoke yesterday about something that has been staying in my mind since then when we talked about this Trump success or scandal, however you want to see it, and say ethically, and we need to add an ethics professor or person to the panel and the next time around, ethically, can we justify using micro-targeting like this if it's not serving personal profit but actually saving the planet? And then Natalia responded, well, that one could also be viewed as having saved America. So it's something that we definitely have to keep talking about in terms of how to ethically integrate that potential for reaching audiences in a way. So we talked about the importance of connecting with the audience, but Arctic issues are, they call for global cooperation. They are Arctic issues, but every person on the planet has to participate for them to change or to improve. So the challenge is not only to reach different kinds of audiences and to message to them in personalized ways, we also have to connect these audiences with one another into a joint effort to save the planet. The reality, however, is, as we all know, different countries and cultures have different, sometimes discrepant values and belief systems. If we look at the political world map right now, we can see gaps in between regions of this world in terms of the importance that they assign to global issues that challenge the sustainability and health of humankind. We see many sites where intractable intercultural conflicts challenge our peaceful coexistence. That said, our challenge also lies in bringing people together from different cultures who believe different stories, even to an extent to which their discrepant stories cause them to defend their own stories in battles. Matthias, you're a political scientist. Your expertise lies in intercultural peace building, global governance, and community building. How does the scientific work and the theories in your field inform what could be done differently or better to bring people into a shared effort toward global issues that threaten the future of our lives?
Well, I will end by saying that we need to build stories of a shared better future. I'm starting with this spoiler so that I don't come across as too pessimistic when pointing out the difficulties of coming up with these stories. Now, probably the vast majority of people on this planet have at some point encountered a picture of a polar bear or an iceberg. that is about it, what they know about the Arctic. And when we think about the future of the Arctic, and this is our concern here, we want to raise awareness of the importance not only of the Arctic as a region or space in and for itself, but in its importance for and on the globe. Still, I think the first thing that one needs to reflect about is that for most people on the planet, the Arctic is very remote and far away and not a part of their daily lives. And this is not just an issue, and I think it's very important to realize that, of communicating science to people. It's also an issue of science. Most scientists in most disciplines, even if they should so, are not concerned with the Arctic at all. I did a little experiment this year. I went to 3 huge conferences: the biggest conference on international politics, the Royal Geographical Society, and the World Congress on Sociology. Thousands of people, the Arctic basically non-existent. So, which points me to the fact that we must not forget and self-reflect, and we are in the middle of it, that in a sense there is also some kind of Arctic bubble, where people are concerned about the Arctic, where they listen, where in itself it is an issue of how you communicate science to politics or civil society. But it is certainly, in a sense, a bubble. And what we are basically talking about here, what we want to find out, is how to expand this bubble, or how to change its limits, or maybe even how to burst it. And there are, of course, ways of merely expanding the bubble, raising awareness of the Arctic by communicating better. And one can then talk about how this is done best. I mean, through social media, through arts, visual representations. One might say the best thing is to get people to the Arctic, get them to go to the Arctic. As we all know, this is a problem in and for itself already. And actually what we probably do not want to have is even more Arctic tourism. And even then, this is a possibility only for a very, very tiny fraction of people living on this planet. So how do you get a global community to engage with the Arctic? And I think it's very important here to distinguish 2 things. The one thing is a globalized but still particularistic community. This is a different thing than a global community. A globalized community, we basically have that here already. I mean, yesterday or 2 days ago, out of a sudden you have Maori from New Zealand being here, and basically from most parts of this planet, we have participants here. But this is a rather particularistic community. The question is, how do you frame the Arctic as an issue of global concern that everybody should be concerned about? And that, of course, is only possible if you manage to frame it as part and parcel of the story of the future of planet Earth. Now, one could quite innocently assume that it might then be rather easy to build a story around this common destiny, common threats. One would think that this might trigger global community building. One would hope so, but looking back at the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, it seems not to be so easy that even a global, commonly shared threat leads to global community building. And the question now is, and I will end with that, there is a need to build stories of a shared better future. The question is, which story? Because under that beautiful cloak of Mr. Story does lurk Mrs. Truth. And Mrs. Truth, unfortunately, says the ice is melting. It's going away. Climate change is happening. The climate change models we are having nowadays do not even take into account, they simply don't do that, of the results of permafrost thawing in 70 to 100 years' time. The models don't go that far. So the story doesn't sound too good. So what is the counter story? Which one should it be? I don't know. Some people have, but that seems to have disappeared, started to propagate stories of refreezing as a global common endeavor. But that needs to be embedded in shared future stories about a better planet. And a better planet that is not one that simply manages the disastrous results of climate change, but that is fully committed to stopping it or even reversing it. We need those stories, but they are very hard to tell in a credible way.
Thank you, Matthias. Thank you so much. And this reminds me on the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Iceland, who stated at the opening session that he's concerned about the negativeness of the stories that we're telling about the future. And he went back to the Icelandic forefathers and explaining the hardships that they faced, which he even said were harder than the ones we're facing now, because we don't have a handbook of how to use, we don't have technology to connect us or to support us, and yet we need to be focusing on actions and do them, and then we will have a future we will like better. And I like the simplicity of those words. But we have a storytelling expert here and a professor leading a storytelling academy. Mike, how can we help, or how can we co-create stories, or help science co-creating, or everybody here co-creating a story of a shared future that will be likable?
Well, I don't think I have an easy answer to that, because as Matthias said, these things are difficult, and storytelling is not necessarily easy. But I think I stand with the German philosopher Ernst Bloch on this, that he talked about daydreaming as a form of utopian storytelling, as a storytelling as a hopeful practice, and that imagination is an important tool that we have. Indeed, lack of imagination, let's face it, never gets us anywhere. I like that. That's attractive to me, because it tells us that storytelling isn't simply about reflecting on the past. It's also about imagining the future, or futures that we want to build for ourselves. And the story can provide us with a roadmap of getting from where we are to where we want to be, no matter how difficult and treacherous that path and that journey may be. So I suppose really my question for all of us today is, what are the stories of the future? And I'm using stories in the plural deliberately there. What are the stories of the future that we want to create? Because I agree that I think without the stories to tell, I'm not sure how we then can determine our future.
Thank you, Mike. Natalia, can digital tools help us? We talk about imagination, about daydreaming, about imagining future stories. Can digital tools help us with such an effort to bring people together and, jointly co-create and become interactive co-participants of creating a story like that?
Jimmy, I think we can say that I guess a lot of daydreaming is already happening online and manifesting in different ways. And thinking if part of the job of science communication is to help people imagine possible futures, then we also need to start looking at how are people already imagining alternative ways of living. And then by focusing on this kind of aspirational futures, already how they are emerging and taking form, of course doesn't mean turning away from the hard realities. We can close our eyes and easily imagine the end of the world, right? It's flooded, it's burning, it's frozen. We have seen it in movies, some people see it in real life. And it's always more challenging to do the opposite. What could an alternative way of living look like and feel like? And where could I feed my imagination about these other types of stories? And I think digital cultures or online activity are one of the many places where we can take a look. I did a case study recently on an internet trend, an aesthetic called cottagecore. Maybe you know what it is, maybe you don't. But I picture the following. You're opening your TikTok account, you're scrolling for videos, and you're seeing content by people who are using their phones to stage very romanticized visions of countryside living. It's a 30-second video that looks like a day spent gardening next to a beautiful small house that you own. You're wearing a second-hand clothing, you're baking, your life is slow. It's always close to sunset, you eat locally, you don't need much, but you have enough. You're not worried about money. But you, the person making this content, that's not where you really live, this is not your life. Usually content like this is play and pretend. The people making these videos are living in small city apartments, working long hours, They're really afraid they're never going to own property. They're never going to be able to retire. And they're feeling climate anxiety. Creating this kind of fantasy content, this speculative play, this fiction, and also consuming this type of content is easy to call it a form of escapism. So these aspirational lifestyles, yes, they're romanticizing and delocalizing aspects perhaps of what we could think of as a more sustainable, peaceful way of life. But my point here is that it's also a very different kind of aspirational lifestyle that, for example, wanting to travel around the world in a private jet. So I think that what we also need to kind of be considering here as communicators is how do we tap into these existing many diverse flows of desire and imagination about sustainability? How can we then use them to help people imagine something that is just not the end of the world? So I think rather than dismissing escapism and play, we should ask ourselves, when people escape reality, where are they going to? And that the answer to that question to be something that we need to take seriously.
Thank you, Natalia. So I would imagine also becoming an active or interactive co-participant in joining into this imagination would also, from a psychological standpoint, fuel behavioral change. And fuel will also be needed for implementing today's insights. Brindis, what possible ways do you see, just concluding this discussion, do you see for politics to push what we talked about today into successful actions so that we can lift the barriers that keep us stuck and move Arctic issues into resolve?
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much. This has been really interesting. I always say when I go to the Arctic Circle, I learn so many things, going to different meetings and meeting new people. And I mean, this is very inspiring here. And I think you managed to make a great panel with all these specialties. And combining that together, I'm sure we can make more high-impact communication plans and how we are going to put our message through. So definitely, I see a lot of opportunities here. I see I have to meet these people more often, and we have to find out what we can do about this. Because as you have all been saying, I mean, we have a lot of facts. And what I'm always kind of afraid about when you were telling the story, what about the truth? Because sometimes I feel like the most popularized politicians are really good in telling stories, and really just focusing on small aspect of what really matters, but not taking like the whole puzzle. So taking all of that into account, that you have so many varieties in that sense, and like when we do a future study, it's not like a one future. We should look into many futures, many scenarios of what could happen. So definitely yes.
Thank you, Brindis. Thank you so much. So we're coming to a beautiful end. We started with a storytelling setting, and we're coming back to conclude this discussion, but not forever. We will continue this discussion in workshops to follow. We already have gathered some interest in that, and we hope that we inspired you in the audience also to continue storytelling about this panel and its contents. And I would like to take a few minutes, and I know that we're at the end of the time. However, the panel ahead of us went over time, so we're also willing to stay here to answer any questions you might have. And there's microphones at the right and to the left, and I'd like to invite you to come down and ask any questions, or if you would like to pose questions to us in a digital way that we could respond to after the panel, also digitally, please feel welcome to screen this QR code and send us questions. Just make sure to include your name and email address so we can reply to your questions that way. So if anybody would like to come and ask a question, please feel free to do so. Yes.
Hello, hello. I really like how you talk about how to tell a story which is true and how to spread the true story. But there is also a saying attributed to Churchill or Mark Twain that a lie will travel around the world before the truth will wear their shoes on. So how to make true story travel faster than the untruth story, or how to stop the untruthful stories to travel?
I think that's a question for me, is it? Yeah.
Sounds like.
Or I think it's a really good question, and I think we have been thinking very long and hard over the past few years about how as storytelling researchers we respond to a post-truth world where lies are presented as truths. I think my own position. I think first of all, I think it's difficult, and certainly we've seen and are seeing lots of instances where untruths and lies gather momentum and spread, and I think that's a real danger. I think the response to that is through more storytelling, in a way, because I think storytelling is a tool that allows us to try and discriminate between truth and lies, and to. I'm reminded there's something in the north of England called the world's greatest lying competition, and the only people who are not allowed to enter that competition are politicians, lawyers, and estate agents, because they're professionals. Anyone else can tell a lie. And it's quite a fun event, but of course what is happening is that people are telling lies, saying, this is a lie. I know you know it's a lie, and you know that I know it's a lie, and I'm calling you out as a liar. So I think storytelling is a way sometimes that we can call out the lies. Exactly how we... maybe I'm an optimist in this, but I think the truth tellers ultimately have better stories. I think that's what we need. We need to make sure that we have the better stories, and the better stories are the ones that get circulated. But there are dangers. I mean, there are lots of examples. I'm not going to pretend that all storytelling is good storytelling. Storytelling can be abused and misused as much as anything else. I'm not sure I've entirely answered your question, but I think it's a very long and difficult. It's a forest of thorns to try and navigate our way through.
Natalia would like to add to the message?
So yeah, maybe like a different type of answer. Kind of going back to the idea that stories don't circulate in a vacuum, I guess, like social media and the digital. I mean, we do need to keep pushing for regulation that holds social media platforms accountable for their moderation practices. We need to kind of continue to support kind of fact-checking efforts. And also, that also when the kind of the ethics of kind of the data we use and collect also play a role, right? Kind of how to make sure that the data that you created for this goal is not reused, for example, for the opposite goal. Mm-hmm. And I think it's also important to kind of, a lot of misinformation is not even about like dismissing the environmental message. It's just misinformation to gather more attention by being more scandalous. It's not even about the environment. It's about, gaining a, monetary gain for other things. So I think we need to keep our kind of definitions of misinformation constantly evolving, because they go beyond the content of the story or even the goal of the story. They're about other things. So I'll kind of add that to that answer.
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you.
May I ask the moderator to excuse me? Can I read forward the question from here?
Yes, of course. Yes. Of course.
I thank you all for a very interesting and intriguing storytelling presentation. And I want to ask you about the present danger and increasing threat of fake news and fabricated narratives, not the least on the causes and consequences of the Ukraine war, and also about the horrifying events taking place presently in Palestine. My name is Gunther Ingersson, and I'm a retired vicar in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Ireland.
Thank you. I think we all understood the message. Who would like to take a stab at an answer?
Well, I don't know if I have really an answer to that, but this is a real threat. Fake news is like a real threat, and talking about social media, I have young children back home, or teenagers, and TikTok message short stories in a way, or news, that are so often coming to my eyes, and they are saying, "Mama, what about this thing here?" And it is unbelievable how fast this goes around the world, how some trends on these social media get exploited in different communities. So I do not have the answer, but please, if you guys have, but this is actually a huge threat to the society, both here in Iceland and everywhere else.
May I ask the ethical professor to give his answer, please?
We don't have an ethics professor yet on the panel.
But yeah, I mean, I can kind of add again to
Digital, yes.
I mean, it's a difficult question because also where does accountability lie, right? Is it the content creators at the level of the account? Are the accounts just reposting what other people are doing? Is it TikTok's responsibility as a corporation? Is it the GDPR in the EU that should be protecting children also against misinformation? So part of what is so difficult to handle is because the answer is yes, all the accountability should be distributed there. So I wish I knew how to solve it, but I think at the moment there are a lot of efforts in holding all these different parts accountable in the role that they are playing, willingly or not, in creating misinformation, in diluting messages to their, without any context. Mm-hmm. And also something here that to keep also into account, right? That when we think about entering this this battle, we're also battling things like, messages that do very, very well usually have an automation factor behind them, right? They're bots posting the same content on Twitter every 2 seconds, while the reporter, the news organization is doing through a human once a day. Mm-hmm. So these battles of misinformation are taking place in very interesting and tricky and difficult to manage.
Mm-hmm. And I think that Mikey would probably speak to this as well, but the storytelling competencies that everybody has access to, and we see politicians, for example, in the United States being very effective storytellers and going up for re-election, not because of content, but because of storytelling skills. So I believe that the reason why we had this panel is as well how to learn those kind of skills for science and being more effective and bringing them into how we communicate about Arctic issues and climate change, in a sense, in crafting those messages so they can become viral and become competing memes also for the messages that we want to avoid. Matthias, do you want to say quick, and then we get into the last question?
Just one quick thing, however, and to bring us back to this issue of futures and the difficulties and necessity to think about futures. We tend to forget often how quickly things change. I attended the first Arctic Circle Assembly 10 years ago, and we then had people talking about micro-targeting, artificial intelligence, and TikTok and fake news. Nobody in the room would have known what discussion was about. And I'm pretty sure 10 years from now, discussion will be about something completely different, which, however, points me to the fact that I think it's very important in terms of storytelling, but also scientific research, to try to get ahead of the wave, to build in more futures and think futures-oriented, which does not mean forget about the past, quite to the contrary. Good future stories take account of different pasts, and I think this is absolutely crucial.
And I promise it's something that we will continue discussing, and we're happy if you would like to contact any of us to share the results of our continuing work group beyond this panel. So there's time for one last quick question. Yes, it's down here. If you would. Yes, thank you.
Like this? Yeah. Thank you very much for a very excellent panel and discussions. It's so well put together. I'm very impressed. I'm Asta. I work in science communication. So I start with the end. Who is going to pay for it? Because I am very aware of the different parts needed here. It is to build credibility, storytelling, and to to include these aspects of ethics, how the social media algorithms are working, having scientists, boards, advisors, doing co-creation, doing rich content in digital medias that reaches the audience. This is what I try to do. I have done it through also when we do it for companies and private sector. Now I'm trying to do it independent from the private sector, and then you don't have specific stakeholders who want to pay for it. The educational system cannot pay for it. I know there are, of course, grants and things like that, but how can we really do this? Because, yes, politicians are really good storytellers. They can tell our story in Iceland about the previous energy transitions again and again and again, and it makes me mad, because this story is not relevant today. Yes. We have told it so many times, and I'm just saying this because if you work with scientists, if you work with the people who have been studying science communication, you talk to the youth, that's the way you can figure out what type of stories we need to imagine those futures together.
Thank you. Amanda, is that a question for you?
I wish I had the answer. I completely agree. I mean, there is funding out there. There's engagement and co-productions being talked about a lot more, and it's being built into funding schemes. But I would argue not in a meaningful way yet. It's not driving funding. It's not, and I think it's really, really difficult because science communication notoriously falls between gaps in terms of funding, and maybe it's how we better align ourselves with those that are getting better funding within science. But I completely agree, and I don't have the answer. I wish I did, but it's something that we need to happen.
Thank you, Amanda. Brindis, maybe just a concluding quick statement, and then we have to wrap up the panel.
Regarding this question,
yes.
Yeah, well, I actually think that the story, how we did it before, matters in the future also, but we can disagree on that. I mean, a part of, if we are founding as a society, and we are founding university, and we are founding science, we find a way to do that if it's through the universities or through different schemes. Then we also have to found a way to get the science and what is coming out of that to the public or to the policymakers. So that should always be a part of the conclusions. If we are founding a scientific to research something, we cannot just have a long paper and this is the result and no one does nothing about it. So it should, in my mind, always be built into the scheme. When we are founding it, we should also find a way to take it through and to get the message there.
Thank you very much, Brindis. I would like to thank everyone for being here, thank the panelists, and wish you a good lunch now. Thank you.